I think you're grossly and wildly over-optimistic about what's been achieved. The most obvious signal of danger was the productivity ticking down. That was quite obvious, and that is a result of the poison pills in the Fair Work Act, which are just working their way through the system. And the other tick is the uptick of the industrial action, which ticked up and then it went a little bit down.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, as you pointed out, with all of the provisions that employers have to meet, and there's also the strike threat. Qantas was disrupted by a threat to strike, so they had to totally revamp their operation for the weekend, and then they went back to work. So the workers lost no pay, but the company was in chaos. So that is a provision that's there as long as we have a framework where the unions have got the freedom to do practically what they like, with the umpire fairly and squarely on their side.
Well, I think on productivity, if we have a look back, just go back further, there has been a downtick in labour productivity, but I don't think this is created from the Fair Work Act. We hear all the time about the labour market shortages. Wages in Western Australia in the mining are incredibly high because of labour market shortages, and that's not the result of the Fair Work Act. I think much of the boom in WA explains some of the reduced productivity that we see here. On industrial disputes, there are a few more things that you can strike over. This is the difference between Work Choice's prohibited content and the Fair Work's unlawful content. So there is a little bit of a give on industrial action, but I think it's far too early to say that we've got a major problem. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
Is it too early to say there isn't a major problem?
Probably. But, I mean, if you have a look at the rules, you see that they haven't changed much. I wouldn't expect to see it going back to even 1996 levels. That's my personal opinion. We'll wait and see.
Thank you. Do you have, I know it's very difficult to talk in generalisations or averages with, in terms of conciliation for unfair dismissal, but do you have some sort of an idea what a sort of outcome might be in terms of the employer and the employee, either in so many weeks' wages or an amount of money, or how does that work?
The payouts?
Yes.
How big are they?
Yes.
They're capped at 12 weeks, but 12 weeks is incredibly high depending on what your wage is. It's a lot easier to say 12 weeks, pay out 12 weeks, than it is to say pay out 20 to 30 grand. So generally speaking, I don't think the payouts are necessarily large.
Yes.
But if you're a small business, you know, you're barely above the margin, those sorts of costs can put you under a fair amount of distress.
Sure.
At least the uncertainty creates a problem. So I don't have the outcomes of the average settlement.
Yeah.
But that would be an interesting point to
yes,
see.
Thinking more in terms of the advantages of reduced strike days and against a payout figure at the end. Well, how big is it? You know, and you've helped with the 12 weeks cap, and I guess that's what everybody thinks of as the most they can get or the most they have to pay. So thank you.
Yeah, there are, in some circumstances you can take, if you've been dismissed, you can take action under adverse action. There's a new provision called adverse action in the Fair Work Act. That's predominantly an anti-discrimination clause, and I haven't looked into it a hell of a lot, but there are a lot of claims being made under adverse action, and yeah, I think that's something to keep an eye on as well.
I'm sorry I came in late, but did you talk about the rules for costs and legal expenses with unfair dismissal? Because you say capped at 12 weeks, 20 to 30,000, an employer would possibly be looking at that in legals, and the question would be if they can be recovered, I mean as a matter of law, let alone a matter of practice. And I just wonder if that might be the real significant sanction.
The cost of action.
Yes.
Yeah, I did mention it briefly. I haven't looked specifically into how much the average cost is, and that's incredibly hard to estimate as well, because it's not just the amount paid in legal fees, but it's also the time sacrificed away from the business to do that. So yes, there is a problem with the compensation, but the bigger problem is the time and the cost of litigation, whether or not the unfair dismissal claim is successful or not.
What go to the front here and then to the back? That might be easiest.
Just on that last question, I thought part of the point of it was about whether a different regime for the allocation of costs might make some impact on the way bargaining proceeds. Because, I mean, I think Justice Ross is the current head of Fair Work, did a PhD at Sydney, which is buried in the bowels of Fisher, where he looks at the conciliation process, and one of his findings in that PhD thesis is that some changes to the rules for about whether you can claim costs and how they're allocated between the parties is a very, very sensitive factor in conciliation outcomes. So I just wondered whether you wanted to comment on that, just following up from the previous question.
The increase in which do you mean by costs?
Cost
of litigation.
Who pays the costs? Like if you come and lodge a claim that's completely ridiculous, if you have to bear your own legal costs and perhaps the other party's legal costs, then it's a significant disincentive to doing that. Do you want to comment on how changes to those cost allocation rules in the way Fair Work operates might have some sort of impact on the bargaining process?
I would have assumed that the conferences, the cost of, obviously the probability of a claim is a significant disincentive, but I haven't done particular work on that sort of a line just yet.
You've spoken primarily about union involvement in economic terms. What about the other role that unions at least advertise themselves as playing with regards to unfair and unjust treatment of employees, particularly with regards to unskilled interchangeable workforces such as the retail industry, where that human dimension actually does have an impact, and where there isn't a place for individual bargaining necessarily. Have you considered these sort of factors, that the union in that case, acting in concert with the employer's role, is to assist the employer get the best out of the employees and make sure the employees aren't getting a raw deal from the employer?
Well, if for workers on awards, generally speaking, employers will give the award wage, and the social impacts, the human impacts on workers, I think, would be much more determined by the relationship between the employer and the employee. So those sorts of things I haven't touched on, but I think that would be pretty difficult to estimate anyway. Does that sort of answer your question?
I was thinking more so about the fact that unions, well, I'm thinking of one particular union which I have some familiarity with, being the SDA, and their role is acting as a go-between in difficult situations for the employers and the employee in general workplace arrangements, not so much financial, not so much wages, but, health and safety and so forth. If we were to see further deregulation, would you perceive those roles being taken over by another government body or organised privately, or how would you see that?
Well, it used to be that if you wanted redress for unfair dismissal, the avenue was through a union before there was legislated protections for employees. Since protections have been brought about through the statutes, there's been less of a role for unions. So if more and more of the unions' roles are available to employees in non-union forms, then of course this will further marginalise unions. If reformers did that sort of thing, unfair dismissals is the easiest one you can locate, then yes, I would expect that to have an impact. And how that has an impact upon employees, it remains to be seen, and depends upon how easy those structures are to pursue.
Thank you. Just a thought on that graph that's in front of us there.
Okay.
The inference is, I guess, that the line is trending down because of the IR legislation. Specifically looking at the endpoints of the graph, there have been a lot of businesses that have gone out of business in recent times, and I think we underestimate the number of small to medium-sized businesses who have voted with their feet and taken their businesses elsewhere to places like New Zealand and Vietnam, which would also have the effect of reducing industrial disputes because there aren't businesses there. And which brings me to the question I wanted to ask you. Would you care to comment on the speech made by Mr. Watson, I think it is, one of the VPs of Fair Work recently, where I understood that he said that the adversarial nature of IR relationships has really been entrenched by Fair Work Australia. And I have a particular interest in small, medium-sized area, and of course that's the thing that destroys those sort of businesses. And most management of small, medium-sized businesses value their employees, and the last thing they need is something that entrenches an adversarial culture amongst them.
Well, I think you're right, and I think Graham Watson was right, and I think the good faith bargaining obligations and also the impact of award modernisation had been part of the causes for this sort of new this entrenchment of adversarial style industrial relations. So yes, he's right, I think, and there are various points in the Act that promote this sort of thing. So I think it'll be an ongoing problem, the extent to which we'll soon find out.
Hi, Alex. I've got really I've got two points. One is a question. First of all, it's a very mysterious subject, and it would be really useful if, as part of your work, if you were able to categorise in simple terms the essential elements of IR law in Keating's time, in Howard's, and now under the Fair Work Act, so that you could see a general picture of the critical elements that have changed. That's just, by the way, I'm not really telling you how to do your job, but I would find that particularly useful. My question is that Tony Abbott believes, I think, or at least that's his public position, is that this Act needs tweaking. That's all. And as you know, his critics say, well, that's going not nearly far enough. What would be your take on that?
I think I saw an interview with John Howard, and he was asked about his work choices reforms, and he commented that Tony Abbott was one of the least enthusiastic about work choices. So under his leadership, it depends upon how much his critics within the Liberal Party can pressure him to do more deregulation. If it were left to him, I think we would see tweaking, but around the edges, I think.
Is that all that's necessary?
Well, if you were to repeal good faith bargaining obligations, that wouldn't be minor. That's not a tweaking around the edge. In putting back the exemption of businesses with 100 employees or less, and the genuine operational reasons, if you were to reconstitute them or reinstitute them, that wouldn't be minor at all. So there does, if you consider those to be major reforms, then major reform is what we need. I'm not sure Tony Abbott will give it to us. We'll soon find out.
Would you just get a comment on the recent Qantas episode and also the ports, where basically, because it would seem that the structure of the whole IR system, the nation basically ground to a halt until these episodes were sort of resolved at almost government level, or certainly in the case of the ports, ministerial intervention. Is the FWA set up responsible for that? How would you fix it?
How would I fix the? That's a hard question.
Well, I mean, it just seems that at the end of the day, the whole system was pushing towards an absolute confrontation where, workers were shut out. And in the case of Qantas and the ports, I don't think we've seen in recent history anything that's remotely like that. Certainly in the last decade. So it does seem to have brought these two major issues to the head, and it would imply that businesses that do have some power of their own are the only ones that are able to stand up to collective industrial action.
I think so, and I think that there are provisions in the Fair Work Act that allow the minister or Fair Work Australia to conclude or stop industrial action if it's creating harm to a third party or one of the parties or the Australian economy in general. And so companies under increased pressure because of the bargaining obligations, in my opinion, will look to lock out employees in the case of Qantas and in the case of the ports. Those things impact very heavily on the economy. And so I think the employers are dealing with the increased power of unions by scaling up the disputes so they can get it so they can draw it to a halt. Now, what this means that we're getting a lot of it in the media. It's definitely a problem, and I think it stems from the obligations of good faith bargaining.
I'll ask the question I was going to ask before. It's about productivity. You showed us the graph with the line bouncing up and down, and rightly pointed out in discussion...
The disputes one? Or
no, the
productivity one.
Productivity one. And rightly suggested that you can't say a lot on the basis of that, because we could be sitting around discussing 10 different topics and looking at the same line and interpreting it in all sorts of spurious ways. The debate really seems to me to be about mechanisms. Now, if you're talking about connections between industrial relations, regulation regimes and productivity, what are the causal mechanisms? What are the connections between the sort of provisions of fair work that you're talking about and productivity outcomes?
I think it's one of the things I mentioned before was majority support determination has decreased managerial prerogative, and I don't want to draw a necessary a connection between managerial prerogative and productivity, but I would think that the rights and obligations of each of the employers and the employees and unions would have something to say about the causal factors. So those are the sorts of things that impact upon the productivity of the workplace. So that's my inkling there, but I haven't done a hell of a lot of work on the productivity effects of each of them, and they're very hard to estimate in any case, as you said.
Thank you for giving me another go. This is the question I was originally going to ask.
Okay.
Thanks. If you had your others and you were going to make the policy for change, is this a fair summary of what you would do? You can add or subtract or modify, of course. You would put in some sort of entrenched statutory minimum. You would remove the good faith bargaining.
Mm-hmm.
You would re-establish the exemption and reform some of the cost provisions on unfair dismissal, and perhaps the arbitral tribunal for those, make it as quick and cheap as possible. And you would also remove the by putting in the minimum, you'd remove the, I've forgotten the exact name of it, but the no worker worse off principle, I think it's called. Is that a fair summary of the headlines, or would you add to that?
It is a fair summary of the headlines. Some of the other work that I've done that I haven't included in tonight's speech is about the scope of agreements too. The scope of agreements has been something that's been progressively narrowed, and part of the reason has been to control strike action. So I would hope that reforms do change around the scope of agreements. But I have no magic pudding on how to create the best industrial relations system either.
Sorry, I should have probably added one prohibited content. Put the prohibited content back to where it was, or not?
I probably would. The no worker worse off thing was part of the award modernisation thing. So, in my opinion, I think we can do without awards, and you just have the statutory minimum conditions. And so, that sort of a system, if you did that, you wouldn't be necessarily leaving workers no worse off. That would depend upon what agreements each business instituted with its own workforce. So I wouldn't be able to know whether all workers would be made worse off, but I doubt no worker would be made worse off. There are always winners and losers whenever there's a major reform.
So Giles, you Okay. Well, I think that looks like the end of the discussion for tonight. I think there's too many people wanting to get off to watch the rugby, I guess. So look, thanks very much everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you very much for helping to refine some of the ideas that Alex is working on. He started off on this topic. It was a total green field for him. He's not really studied labour markets, and I think in a short period of time has gotten on top of a very complex issue, as I said at the start.
I hope so.
I think you have. I suspect for the next year or so it's going to be quite an important political battleground as well, and I suppose good policy and good ideas and forming good policy will have to go under the surface a little bit, but certainly we're going to continue on with this, and even if it gets on to talking about privatising the buses in Sydney or something like that, that'll happen as well. But thank you very much, Alex. Thank you everyone again and for coming out a night like this, and we'll hope to see you next time.